two events, I think, strike me as of particular significance and in a way connected. I mean, it's a kind of matrix of three things at once with an underlying connecting thread. The three news stories of the past week I'm thinking of are, first of all, Senator Bernie Sanders introduced a bill, a set of resolutions, technically in the United States Senate, that in my view was too modest, actually, but certainly was better than the alternative, simply calling on the United States government to observe United States law, much less international law, by reporting back to Congress on Israel's use of the enormous amount of weapons we send its way. That led to the Senate Democratic leadership, as well as the President of the United States, opposing this bill, and the Democrats using a parliamentary procedure to make sure there's not even a vote on it. And yet, to what would be the embarrassment of the Democrats if they were capable of embarrassment, I think in the same 24-hour period, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for the two senior beneficiaries of their largesse, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, and Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister. Additionally, Chuck Schumer and other Democrats have indicated support for a so-called anti-Semitism bill that censors free speech about Israel and Palestine in this country. And thirdly, and I'm sorry to go so long, but I do sense a pattern here, and I'm wondering if you sense it as well. In a, I think, dramatically underreported development, President Biden gave Ukraine permission to fire long-range missiles into Russia, which had previously been forbidden because of the fear of escalation, potentially to nuclear war. I see all these things and I think, it's like spotting constellations in the night sky. There's probably something tying these things together. But what do you think? Am I seeing connections where none exist?
Well, I think there are connections, and the real connector is the fact that in early November, Donald Trump won the election for the US presidency against Kamala Harris. And I think at least number one and number three on your list are related to that. In what way? Let's reverse the order. Well, it's been made very clear by Donald Trump that he is interested in extricating the United States from supporting the Ukrainians in continuing the war, being driven really by the West and NATO and the Europeans following along, of the United States really pushing the agenda. Donald Trump has said, look, the US is going to stop financing this war. Big statement. And in fact, I think a credible statement, because he's placed a number of important people who take that view in positions of authority, including Tulsi Gabbard as head of national intelligence. And now people may say, well, there's a neoconservative at Secretary of State, but let's not overplay the Secretary of State position. It's a largely ceremonial position. You got to carry a bucket for the president. You don't really have space to drive an agenda. I think Marco Rubio.
Let me just interrupt you for a second to say that since the genocide in Gaza began, the Secretary of State has basically been a spokesperson for the military support the U.S. provides to that war crime. So I certainly don't see him as a force for diplomacy in American politics.
Well, Richard, you know the history of this better than I, but I don't know when the last time you can remember a U.S. Secretary of State actually charting out a position which had some tension with the president. I don't remember that. I mean, you could say, well, Kissinger, but that's prehistory. So Trump is committed in some way or the other to pulling out of the Ukrainian imbroglio. I think that's pretty certain. And so here comes Biden to trap Trump, because by allowing Ukraine to fire US-provided missiles, intermediate-range missiles, into Russia on Russian territory would, hopefully for the Biden administration, provoke Russia to expand the war and then sink any expectation of a US pullout. Now, interesting how the Russians reacted. The Russians actually didn't take the bait. They didn't fire their intermediate missiles into a third country territory, which they could have done. I mean, they could have threatened a US military base in Germany. They could have struck Ramstein base. A very provocative, dangerous move. What they did instead was they took out of their arsenal an intermediate range missile with 6 different warheads, which they hadn't used previously, and fired that into Ukraine, onto Ukrainian territory, saying that if you expand the war into our territory, we have weapons which we haven't used yet in Ukraine, which we could use to obliterate Ukrainian, military places, the bases, and so on, or maybe even hit a city. I think their reaction is interesting. It may give pause in Ukraine to use the British and US missiles. So the third point you raised of Biden's very dangerous allowance that Ukraine can fire onto Russian territory, I think was intended to sandwich Mr. Trump. That's the first, your third, but the first. Now, going back to your first point, which is Bernie Sanders putting a bill in the Congress talking about weapons sales. Listen, on one level, this is too little too late.
Right.
Bernie Sanders should have been doing this, in fact, right through the legislative session, almost every week, putting a lonely member bill in, getting 5, 6, 8 people to support him. This time he got 19. If he does this on a regular basis, will he be able to have pushed the Democrats? It's a little too late because this is not going to, sandwich Trump, because Trump, in fact, in terms of Gaza, might take the money the United States was spending in Ukraine and provide it to the Israelis. This might have been Bernie Sanders' attempt to try to hem Trump in. If Trump then decided when he comes to office to give Mr. Netanyahu even more carte blanche. Frankly, I don't think there's any more carte blanche able to be given, but he could have given different weapon systems that the Israelis don't have. For instance, the mother of all bombs, much larger than the 2,000-pound bomb, could have provided that. I think Sanders may have been reacting again to the election of Mr. Trump. I'm not sure. So those two, I think, were reactions to Mr. Trump's election. The ICC warrant is interesting. Karim Khan, the head prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, actually applied for this warrant 6 months ago. Now, the Israelis knew that the warrant was in process, so they did a very clever thing. They made what I think all good lawyers do when it's a question of any kind of criminal action, is they start arguing for jurisdiction. Does the ICC have jurisdiction? Right. And they try to wrap the ICC in the whole jurisdiction question. You'll notice that the statement made by the ICC said, the first line was, the ICC has ruled that yes, we have jurisdiction and we are, putting out these warrants. The first case of jurisdiction they set aside. They said, well, we do have jurisdiction, it's universal jurisdiction, and Mr. Netanyahu is now with a warrant for crimes against humanity and war crimes, and his former, as you said, former defense minister. Now, this is very interesting because Yoav Gallant, who had, by the way, joined Likud a long time ago, they've been trying to say that this was a government of national unity, bringing together, let's say, the far right, Mr. Netanyahu, and more liberal element. Well, now Israeli politics is really stuck because when Gallant was beginning to break with Netanyahu over the last few months and then eventually was fired, there was an expectation that in Israel, Yoav Gallant would run a campaign against Netanyahu and try to get him out of office at the next election. Well, if that is indeed the case, you'll have two people with arrest warrants from the ICC running to be Prime Minister of Israel. I think the ICC has done something quite interesting for the future of Israeli politics. Of course, I think this is now coincidental that the ICC warrant was revealed at around the time of these other events. But I wouldn't I wouldn't like to say it was entirely coincidental, because I think this is also good timing. Good timing can have no astrological reason to have transpired, but it's nonetheless good timing. In other words, Mr. Netanyahu is got to now face the fact that if when Trump comes in, Trump becomes the president, wants to give carte blanche to Netanyahu, he's giving carte blanche to a guy with a war criminal arrest warrant sitting on his head.
Right. And let me just respond in a couple ways. Throw a couple things out and see if any of them resonate with you. One is I'll make a brief, I don't feel vehement about it, I'll make a brief definition of my connection theory. Well, the one thing that does connect these three events, I mean, you're right, the ICC is a little different, but connects U.S. continued support for Israel with Biden's decision, and then this pro-genocide bipartisan ferocity is, of course, the U.S. weapons industry, right? I mean, and national security industry, which is whether you want to call it double government, or now that the term deep state has been attacked so vehemently, but there is a large coterie of people in national security and defense who move in and out between government and these various corporations. There's one connection. I think you're right about, it's a great point about Biden wanting to box Trump in. And I have to just briefly observe that, while I've been appalled by many of Trump's appointments, something struck me in the New York Times, and I'd love your thoughts on this. But it was an article, it was a commentary on how appalling Trump's appointments had been and how utterly disreputable they were, and it listed four of them. Tulsi Gabbard, and then this guy's now stepped down, Matt Gaetz, and Pete Hegseth for defense secretary, and I can't remember the fourth. And the gist of it was, at one point, I screenshotted it. Three of them, this one, and the last one, were discredited in part because of sexual assault allegations. Tulsi Gabbard, it said, was discredited because she claimed that NATO's insistence on placing weapons in Ukraine was a factor in Russia's invasion. And, like they say, one of these things is not like the others. I mean, that's not an accusation of a crime. That's a contextual interpretation in many ways that I basically agree with. Now, I can despise many of Trump's positions and many of his people. Okay. But the fact is, it's now, this was the Washington Post, we've reached a point in American mass media where challenging the military narrative on any of this, the utterly ahistorical narrative, is the equivalent of sexual assault. I don't know how else to put it, but to me, that's how polluted the discourse has become, as like exposing yourself to the media as an act of self-injury at this point. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, let's spiral into the conversation about Trump's picks, because I really do have some thoughts about some of these people, and then we can come back to this question. First, obviously, one has to really look carefully at who's being chosen and what might come out of it and so on. But I mean, we've been through this before. Lots of interesting people get cabinet picks. United States is in that one sense unusual, that you don't actually have to run for political office to hold a ministry. In many countries, parliamentary system, you have to be a member of parliament and so on. The US, you can get any crackpot to take any role. I mean, the question of the consent of Senate is all got to do with numbers, not really whether the person themselves is equipped for the job. I mean, you and I can sit down and make a list of a whole bunch of nutcases that have had positions, or people from Goldman Sachs, who just take treasury as if it's their birthright, over and over again. Okay. So Robert Kennedy, very interesting pick for the health department. Why? Well, because, obviously people are focused on the things he says about vaccines and this, that. I'm not interested in that debate. It's an enormously contentious debate, and I don't think it's fruitful to get into it between you and I, because I don't think either of us have a huge stake in that debate. But what I find interesting is this is the first time Health and Human Services is going to be run by somebody who has expressed deep skepticism and also a sense of outrage with big pharma's grip on drug prices and on the testing industry, how they test drugs. I mean, we've never really had a person in power suspicious of corporate medicine. Now, okay, I mean, it's true that sometimes corporate medicine can come up with some pretty extraordinary medications, but also the drugs are so expensive. And Robert Kennedy has freely expressed his sense of skepticism. I'm interested. Will Mr. Kennedy be able to go toe to toe with Big Pharma? Let's wait and see. I put that in an envelope. We can open it later, but it's in an envelope.
Sure.
I'm interested. What's going to happen? Secondly, I know that people are all bent out of shape about Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy running a department called Doge. It's a pretty ridiculous name, whatever it is, government efficiency. But in the last week, Elon Musk has done a couple of tweets that I found quite interesting. One of them is every year there's an audit done of the Pentagon. And every year, the Pentagon shows that they cannot account for 40 billion, 100 billion, enormous amounts of money. They just can't account for it. I mean, where did it go? We don't know. And somebody writes that off. It's almost like, Richard Eskow is doing his taxes. He can't account for $100. He just says, well, $100, who cares, whatever. You're just going to wipe it out of your memory. I don't know where I left that money. There was a check. I don't know where it went, that kind of thing. Billions of dollars. Elon Musk makes a tweet about that. I would be very interested. This is the second envelope. Would Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, would they go after the weapons industry and waste? The F-35 bomber? Would they consider looking into these audits and the money just lost by the Pentagon? Very interesting circus ready to open, Richard. So that's the second one. I'm not saying, oh my God, this is 4 years of hell. I'm saying possibility that some of these people might take their libertarianism to the extreme and take on entrenched interests like the pharmaceutical industry and the weapons industry. I don't know. In fact, Mr. Trump saying, well, we're going to withdraw from supporting the war in Ukraine, he's going to face pushback from the weapons industry. Why? When Vladimir Zelensky came to Washington, D.C., yes, he met the Congress and he did his dance there. But remember, the photo opportunity was in a very ordinary looking office room where he was sitting at the head of a table, and all the CEOs of arms companies were there. Lockheed, Raytheon, all of them, Boeing, was sitting at the table, come to talk to Mr. Zelensky. So that's the second envelope. Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk, Mr. Donald Trump, are they going to take on the weapons industry? I'm interested to see that. Now, it's also true, coming to your point, that it is, a fact that a lot of members of the far right have very disreputable personal lives. I think this is something that has come out quite directly. These people are very, very sketchy in terms of their personal histories. I mean, Mr. Matt Gaetz, saying, I'm sending money to somebody just because, and you're awesome for your awesomeness. I mean, these are some people, some of them are apparently underage. Very sketchy private lives led by these people. And this is not, a surprise. This has been the case for a long time. The far right attracts people with very, very, enormous sense of personal entitlement, the way they behave towards others. I think that's what attracts them to the far right. They feel like they are Ubermenschen, Superman, they can do anything.
Right.
And well, every time there's cabinet appointees of the far right, scrutiny brings up some of these things. Now, of course, Mr. Trump is very much along these lines. He doesn't need Senate scrutiny because he won a popular election. But remember, if he was to go before a Senate committee and all that stuff came out of grab them by the this and that, it's the disreputable way in which he has handled himself in his private life, and that I think is what comes out. As far as Tulsi Gabbard is concerned, look, she is a mercurial person, extremely mercurial. I mean, there are a number of people like that in US politics that, just are anti-war at some point, or they are anti-something. But you can't really pin down their politics because they don't come out of a political tradition. I can name others. I don't want to. I know some of them personally, but people can fill in the blanks. There are people who, on some issues, are very progressive, but there's
Absolutely. Some of them
something
reprint
off
my
about them.
essays.
Yeah.
I mean, probably yours too, my columns. No, I understand precisely what you're talking about. And, but to me, there is, in what might be called the elite pushback to all of this, there's a beneficial side effect for them, or maybe it's not a side effect, maybe it's calculated, which is that, and that's why, for example, I began with my, the three sexual assaulters and Tulsi Gabbard questioning, bringing up a historical fact about, Ukraine's NATO membership. It's always been a red line for Russia, predating Putin. But is that this has, and I'm glad you brought up Bobby Kennedy because for all of his peccadillos too, I was reading on, healthcare financing and economics used to be my professional area when I had one. And they're very good ideas, some of them. I mean, they're things people like me have been fighting for years. If I were a betting man, I'd say perhaps Elon and Bobby Kennedy and so on won't be there a year from now, but we don't know. That's why you put it in an envelope. But the point is this: it gives people in power a great way to use guilt by association to discredit ideas that you and I agree with or believe in. And frankly, I think they've been quite effective at least among like base Democratic voters, in convincing millions of people that these extremely sensible and humane and reasonable ideas are part and parcel with saying that Haitian immigrants will eat your pets. I mean, this is a very useful propaganda tool, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I completely agree. For instance, I would suggest that partisanship has come at such a cost that if, for instance, Mr. Kennedy starts going after Big Pharma, there may be a Democratic coalition that will come out to defend Big Pharma. I think that's a pity, because if Mr. Kennedy does go after big pharmaceutical companies talking about bringing prices down, I hope people on the left will say that's a good idea, on the merits of it. I hope Bernie Sanders, who's been fulminating for universal health care, comes in and says, well, look, if you're going to bring prices down, what about thinking about a different healthcare regime? Trying to expand the debate, not taking the side of big pharma on this. In the same way, if the United States is going to, under Mr. Trump, scuttle NATO, because NATO is a Trojan horse of the United States. It's not a European project. It's a US project. Shut it down. It should have been shut down decades ago. There's no need for it. The Europeans can have their own security, and maybe not. Maybe this European war was imposed on Europe by the United States, by its elites. And the Europeans have gone along and now discovered that this is appalling for their populations. I mean, Germany government is going to fall on this issue. Was that worth it for Olaf Scholz? He thinks he's going to come back to power in the next Bundestag election. Very much doubt it. The polls are looking bad for him. His defense minister was going to run against him for the Social Democratic leadership and then pulled out, saying Mr. Schultz is a good chancellor. Good chancellor? He barely has an approval rating. I mean, his situation is morbid. And so if people like Gabbard and others are going to make an argument in public or in private with Mr. Trump, saying, look, maybe it's time to disengage from NATO. This demand of 2% defense is not going to happen unless the United States pulls out of Ramstein and 4 or 5 military bases, one in Italy, a couple in Germany, just as a demonstration effect. Also, it reduces the US military footprint and the military spending overseas. Do all of those things and build a couple of bridges in the US. Sounds great to me, frankly. It doesn't matter to me who's the president at some level. What matters is what are the policies that they're going to drive. I mean, what I'm trying to say is not that, hey, listen, Trump is going to be great. What I'm trying to say is the attitude of resistance, which was there in the first Trump administration, might not be valuable in this second one. In this second one, I think it may be more valuable to have a very sort of, a precise understanding of where to fight this administration, and sometimes where to say, well, let's let them start a discussion and then let's enter it. It shouldn't be a let's fight them at every turn, because I think then you're going to miss the situation and also alienate more and more people who can be brought into the conversation.
And an implicit in what you're saying, at least for me, Vijay, is that the underlying reality that as Trump has led his party away from the quote unquote bipartisan status quo of the past 40, 50 years, as he has done that, the Democrats in what we have, which is a two-party system, have positioned themselves as the defenders of the status quo, and the resistance, quote unquote, against Trump's first administration became a defense of the status quo, which is why I think the Democrats lost this year, because nobody except people inside the Washington Beltway like the status quo. It's not working for most people. So if the opposition to Trump, the resistance, becomes a defense of the status quo, that's disastrous for everyone. That to me is implicit in what you're saying. And if I'm right, I guess that leads us to what might be, our concluding topic, which is, what do we on the left, the authentic left, not the sort of virtual reality left of symbolic self-positioning and self-display and so on, what do we on the left do to lay the groundwork for a world in which, and the United States is not the world, I'm deeply aware of that. So I speak about the world and not just the United States, because this is a global phenomenon where the choice is not simply between the status quo or an erratic and unpredictable, far right. They've demonized populism. I tend to think left populism is the way to go, simply, speaking, oversimplifying. But I don't know, as we enter into the Trump era and God knows what era in Germany and in other parts of the world, you have any thoughts on what the left, how we sort of germinate a better future?
Well, look, I think you're quite right. I mean, I think to be a status quo defender at this moment, to pretend that the status quo is good and that what might come is horrible is, I think, really missing the point. The status quo is not working. You're right. I mean, the status quo has high inflation, is war, is insecurity, is precariousness, is all of that. It's not working for most people. At our institute, right after the election, we made a little graph, basically in-house graph. We looked at 3 data points. Up here was the inflation line. Down here was the wages line. And above here, somewhere off the screen, was the S&P 500. So you had, Kamala Harris saying the economy is doing great. Well, if this is inflation and your wages are down here, right through the Biden administration, you're not doing great. Your economy is not doing great. And that's people on fixed incomes, working class, and so on. The people up here at the S&P 500 level, they were doing fine. But, they are not a majority. They can't vote you in. If you want to be the party of them, you're not going to win an election. You're going to have to take power by other means. So you can't be a status quo defender. The status quo is miserable. The question is, how does one operate against somebody like Mr. Trump, who speaks against the status quo, but at the end actually concedes to it? That was what his first term was like. Like, for instance, Mr. Kennedy is going to talk about taking on big pharma. Okay, that's why I said put it in the envelope. Let's come back in 6 months. Bobby Kennedy goes out there. I'm going to take on, we should get somebody in Congress to hold hearings, blah, blah, blah. Okay, he's gone in 3 weeks. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy say, we're going to, cut everything. We'll do the melee on the United States. But they're going to discover that more than 60% of the US budget goes to effectively the military world.
Right.
You're going to cut anything, pal. There's no money left to cut in social welfare. Which program are you going to cut? The child poverty advances, that's all been sliced out anyway. It came in as an addition, an add-on in the COVID spending. It's ended. Child poverty is increasing in the United States. There's nothing to cut on the social side. You're going to cut education. How much less are you going to give for education? Soon there'll be no public education system. They're going to have to face the fact that if you're going to cut significant cuts, you're going to start cutting the military. Take on the status quo. That's why I said the two principal fault lines in the United States political economy regarding the government is the medical industry, big pharma, and the weapons industry. These are the two major fault lines. This one controls the entirety of your healthcare, and this controls the machinery of death. These are the fault lines. And if you're going to actually confront them, actually confront this status quo. The status quo isn't finance. Nobody's going to touch finance. Even right. Trump is going to bring in safe hands to deal with finance. Tariffs, that's going to be drama. End of the day, there really aren't going to be tariffs on Europe and so on. They'll raise the tariffs on China. It's going to have a big impact on inflation in the US. Then they'll create loopholes. I don't think that's serious. They're not going to seriously create mayhem in finance. But pharma, weapons. Let's see how far they go. If they're going to shake things up, I want to be there to watch that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, the third huge pot of money is Social Security. And Trump initially insisted he wouldn't cut Social Security, but I'm also watching to see whether, because his entire party is committed to cutting it and has been since 1935, nothing has really changed. So that will be the other, because there's an enormous constituency for Social Security. And if he goes after that, he's actually risking massive citizen backlash. So, all right, well, it's going to be interesting. I think that turned out retrospectively to be the theme of our conversation, Vijay. It's going to be it may not always be an easy ride, but it's going to be an interesting one, right?
I mean, I agree. Look, I mean, as much as you do, I have my serious fears about a Trump presidency. Neither of us are sitting here, born again Trump people. That's just ridiculous. Anybody to take that as the meaning doesn't understand what we're talking about. On the other hand, I think the sort of, like a totally contrarian position forgets that there are contradictions and there's a class struggle at work. Things are not black and white. We're dealing with the contradictions. You got to get into the contradictions. Trump is going to face serious contradictions because, as you said, if he went after Social Security, he's going to go after his own base, and that's not going to happen. So there's very little left for a US president to touch when it comes to being a kind of melee-like anarchist tearing down the government buildings. And because you're at the bone, you're going to have to turn to the flesh. And nobody has tested what it means to hit pharma and weapons. And really, here, any sensible person in the United States should say to Trump, should encourage, be the fire starter, to say, hey, Kennedy, hey, Elon, go for it. We're right behind
Right,
you.
right. No, that's a great point. Yeah. Sure, go ahead. Knock yourself out, which I actually agree with. So, on that note, Vijay Prashad, director of the Tricontinental, which can be found at thetricontinental.org. Thanks for all the great work you continue to do, and thanks so much for coming back on the program.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks a lot.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.